Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I am Annie Kuo. Following Indian Prime Minister Modi's high-profile visit to the United States, India hosted the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, where he appeared virtually alongside Russia's Putin and China's Xi Jinping. Despite the Biden administration's desire to deepen ties with New Delhi to counter China's growing ambitions in Asia, the two seem to align only on interest but not values. What exactly is India's strategy? Joining us today are Chen Ping-kuei, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Associate Professor, Raymond Sung, the Prospect Foundation Vice President, and Fu-kuo Liu, National Chengchi University Research Fellow, International Relations, Taiwan Center for Security Studies Director. A very warm welcome to all of you to the show. Now, previously I just mentioned that India recently hosted the 23rd Summit of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, a few things that we have to look into. First of all, it was held virtually. Second of all, it was held virtually, and this is why we're not seeing any group photos in person publicly between Xi, Putin, and Modi. And of course, India had announced they're not going to endorse China's Belt and Road Initiative when all the other countries did. So, Professor, what did you think was the possible reason or calculation behind India's decisions?
So this is actually a very consistent position of India. The Belt and Road Initiation has a China-Pakistan economic corridor. Inside it has a railroad coming through the Kashmir region in the northern side of Pakistan, and India claimed it is its own territory. So it says this BRI project is in violation of its sovereignty. So that's why India didn't sign up BRI, and India always opposed BRI. So it is natural that it didn't sign this declaration that endorses BRI.
But while we're saying that it's so natural, but how do you think that China's reaction will be towards this, Vice President?
Well, China has to respect India's position because of the tensions between the two countries, and also for India, they've been very suspicious of what China is doing around its borders, including the case of Kashmir, when China been adopting a more intervening approach, and also China-Pakistan economic corridor, and also, of course, Pakistan and India has been traditionally foes. And China's been really residing with Pakistan. And also what China did with the maritime Belt and Road, what China is doing around the Indian Ocean, including Maldives, also arouses much suspicions in India.
And Director, did you think border dispute was actually one of the reasons as well?
Yes. Very important thing is just a look before June 2020, when the new round of conflict between India and China started around the area called Galvan Valley. Before that, Prime Minister Modi visited China, shared a very good friendship with President Xi Jinping. But since then on, all the public opinion in India shifted completely. So it makes the decision maker in New Delhi much harder to resume back to the relations with China. So this is quite natural. Looking back for the last few years, India and China have not shared such good relations on the border issue. So 2020 there was an incident. 2022, last year, there was a new round of conflict. Even if not many soldiers killed, but it is another new round of conflict. But early this year, April, Chinese government released these new names for the so-called Southern Tibet, which is a part of Arunachal Pradesh.
Right.
India government obviously is not very happy with such a development, but China already renamed a number of river, city, town, and also mountains onto the new map for China. So putting everything together, and also plus US and China strategic competition, obviously this is very clear. India now is gradually moving toward the United States.
Right. And to follow up on that, especially when Modi visited a high-profile visit to Joe Biden in the U.S., they also released a statement jointly together that the U.S. and India will be one of the closest partners in the world. So initially people were still observing India, thinking that they're just trying to see how India was wavering in between the two superpower nations. But after this visit, can we also confirm that Modi has officially joined the pro-U.S. alliance, Director?
Officially, probably now siding with the U.S., but we have to really look down whether the policy is now from New Delhi shifting away from their long-standing policy, non-alignment policy. But I personally have a different interpretation, because India is looking into the interest, while the U.S. is also requesting India to join American anti-China alliance. So on this particular point, both India and the United States share mutual interests, and they have a common interest vis-a-vis China. But it is still too early or hard to say whether India is completely, fundamentally shifting away and joining this counter-China alliance.
Professor, do you think India will still continue to be neutral for quite a long time?
So India has a diplomatic tradition not to take sides and not to join blocs. So during the Cold War, we call it non-alignment movement. It's part of a non-alignment movement. Its foreign policy has a clear signature of non-alignment, not joining any bloc. After the Cold War, another term is more often used: strategic autonomy. Essentially, they are very similar. It means that India will take its own road. It would not join great power struggle. It would not depend on any great power. So, if I were to say to define Indian foreign policy, I would say Indian foreign policy is very practical. It's very flexible, and it focuses on its autonomy and try to avoid being dependent on any great power. So the situation you just mentioned, India would try to ask what benefit it will get from its cooperation from the U.S. instead of just thinking about whether it wants to join a bloc or not.
And I think I want to move on towards, because Professor just mentioned that India has been adopting the strategically autonomous approach when it comes to foreign policy. And we're seeing that the world used to regard India as strategically autonomous or non-aligned, or at the same time in multilateral alliances or power balancing. So again, if we go back to the terms and these strategically wordings, can you please explain to us a little bit more between the two, the differences? And of course, we will also like to know, after visiting the US, do you still think that there will be a noticeable change to the current policy that they're holding up to right now?
Okay, so it's a very common mistake to think the non-alignment policy or strategic autonomy is a policy of isolation or neutrality. It is not. India, even during the Cold War, has been very active in international affairs.
Right.
It approached to other countries very constantly. So it would not be something like India want to stay aside of any international events. On the contrary, India always tried to develop relations with different powers, with developing countries, but as well as developed countries. So more recently, we see India and U.S. are getting closer. I think I agree with Dr. Liu Fu-kuo. It is because they have this strategic opportunity, and India see that it will have benefit. It will gain interest from it. So far, it is their mutual interest to get closer, but to develop an alliance relationship or treaty alliance, that will be still very far away.
That's still far to say.
Yes.
And Vice President, do you agree with this?
Yes, of course. Yes, I need to underscore what the Professor just said about the pragmatism in India's foreign policy.
Right.
And of course, traditionally, India has its own considerations. For example, in recent events about, for example, condemnation of Ukraine war, and India has never voted to condemn Russia. and it's always in the United Nations voted for abstention.
Yes.
And out of the consideration that traditionally the military supplies and weaponry supply has been, India has been relying on Russia's provision, and especially that need even grows in terms of needing to prepare itself against the northern borders enemies, China. So India needs to take that into consideration, but siding with the US and getting closer to the US also bring interest for India to get rid of this attachment to even freer, get India even freer in terms of military cooperation, intelligence cooperation, and weaponry production and technology acquisition. So it's really treading very carefully between Russia-China alliance and also Quad and United States.
So we talked about that India is practical. At the same time, it is flexible. Now, this may also build a positive note to the U.S. If we take a look at this graph, it indicated that Russia has traditionally served as India's main arms supplier. If we take a look at 2008, defense trade between the United States and India was relatively insignificant or almost zero. Now move on to 2022, it has surpassed more than 20 billion US dollars. At the same time, the US has also entered agreements to co-produce fighter jet engines and also supply Predator drones to India. So what does that mean for the US at this point of time?
All right, taking the Biden-Modi communicate, for example, they put much emphasis on the cutting-edge technology that India could produce for advancement of the partnership between US and India. For example, in the area of semiconductors, in space technologies, and also in quantum computing, and also in AI. So they called it a very, very closer technological, innovative partnership between the two. But beyond that, the communique also have several highlights in terms of defense cooperation. For example, saying that the US will enabling the production of GE F414 engine jet flight to be based in India. Also for the maintenance of naval vessels of US could use the India's ports. And also about deepening the cooperation, the consultative mechanism, for example, Quad. So those are trying to explore the fields that presented potential for closer maintenance, closer security cooperation between the two countries.
So we're seeing that there's a lot more dialogue between the US and India right now in terms of militarily especially. And Director, you just mentioned earlier, however, that, like Professor Chen mentioned, that India is practical and flexible. It has long adopted that they're not going to build any alliance with either of the countries. But right now we're seeing that based on this anti-sentiment to China that India has, and now there's more dialogues between India and the US. Why do you think that India shouldn't just take side right now, immediately? Why do you still think that this may still take a very long time? Is it because they wanted to stick to that policy they've been having for years?
Because on this dialogue and cooperation between the US and India, basically the US has a strong motivation, while India is looking into something else. I do believe they are hoping to have a deepening the cooperation with the United States, not really changing their position. As this geopolitical transformation is taking place in the Indo-Pacific.
So do you think it's also because India knows that they can leverage this for the US?
Yes, obviously. Now, three big countries except Russia, China, US, and India, they are playing significant role.
Right.
Not just for this the most populous country, but also the number 5 economy in the world. In the next decade also, is going to take over Japan to become the number 3 very soon. So with this positive development, obviously the US already look into the possibility India is an inevitable balancer to China in the region.
And Professor?
Yeah, one thing that was mentioning is that India knows pretty well that it relies on Russian ourselves. So in recent years, since 2020, it started multiple projects to indigenize its own weapon systems. So in the future, we may see that India will rely on foreign arms sales less and less. But don't be mistaken. The most important, the most expensive weapon system will still have to be coming from either Russia or France or the United States.
As we know right now, despite the current situation we're seeing, India will still stay its neutrality in the Indo-Pacific region. But at the same time, it's economically rising very quickly. Let's now turn to Aparna Pande, Director of the Initiative on the Future of India in South Asia at the Hudson Institute, and also the author of Making India Great, The Promise of Reluctant Global Power. Our political editor, Rathwain, spoke to her about Modi's foreign policy.
Aparna, India has long stressed strategic autonomy. Can India still afford to not take sides?
India believes in multipolarity. India has believed in it for decades. And the fact that the Indian Prime Minister can meet the US President, then host the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit a few weeks later, and in a few months host the G20. From India's point of view, it demonstrates the fact that India can maintain strategic autonomy, that the world as it is today actually is a world where multipolarity and strategic autonomy can do very well. So India does not see any contradiction. And as of now, India does not have to make a choice because the United States has been quite accommodative and understanding of India's relationship with Russia. India's desire for strategic autonomy, and yet India's alignment or closer alignment with American partners and friends. So as of now, India does not see any problem, and I don't see India facing any issue currently.
Some say that the common threat of an increasingly aggressive China is bringing India and the US closer. Do you see that substantially happening in terms of defense and technology?
Yes, the two countries have come closer together. They are aligned. Sort of part of India's strategic autonomy means that India does not join any security alliance. So India is not an American ally. It is a friend or a partner. It is closer aligned. The recently signed Defense Industrial Roadmap, which followed from the initiative on critical and emerging technologies signed in January of this year, shows how far the two countries, India and the US, plan to go, both in civilian and in defense technology, in co-production, co-development from semiconductors to jet engines. So yes, the two countries are closer aligned, but if India gets closer to the United States, if it becomes almost an ally, it will happen because China has increased its pressure or China has become more aggressive, not because India wants to do it. And second reason would be if Russia gets closer to China. Russia or the Soviet Union have long been one of India's suppliers for defense equipment. But for India, Russia has long been a counterbalance to China. The closer Russia gets to China, the closer India will get to the United States.
Do you see that happening in the near future?
I see it. I see a greater possibility of Russian dependence on China. If Russia, as long as the sanctions remain, Russia cannot access dollars. Russia cannot get access to any technology. Russia will need spare parts. It will need technology, and it will get that from China, which means it becomes a junior partner at some level, especially in some areas with respect to China. One impact of that has already happened on India. India used to pay Russia historically either in dollars or in rupees, the Indian currency. It cannot pay Russia in dollars for the oil that India is importing from Russia. And Russia does not want rupees anymore, but there's nothing it wants to buy from India. So India is having to pay Russia in Chinese currency. And Delhi would not be very happy about that. So the longer the Ukraine conflict lasts, the closer Russia gets to China, there will be an impact on India-US relationship and closer Indian alignment with the United States.
Going back to technology, Taiwan is a major supplier to the world, especially in terms of chips, and India is also well known for its IT talent and technology. And Taipei is also opening a new office in Mumbai. Is this a testament to the growing Taiwan-India relationship?
Absolutely. The two countries do not have formal diplomatic relations, but India has long had a senior diplomat heading its representative's office in Taipei. And Taiwan has 3 representative offices in India now. The first was in Chennai in 2012. There's one in Delhi and the one in Mumbai, which is supposed to be set up very soon, either this year or next year. From around $1 billion in trade a few years ago, the two countries have their trade stands at $8 billion. The two are also working together on things like, for example, Foxconn has a manufacturing unit for iPhones, if I'm not mistaken, in Tamil Nadu, India's southern state, and they're setting up another factory in Karnataka soon. And Foxconn is also interested in setting up a semiconductor plant. India needs technology, modern technology. It has the software, the people. It doesn't have the hardware, which is the technology.
What's leading to this in terms of strengthening ties between the two countries?
So I'd say it's a combination. One, India has maintained a relationship with Taiwan for a long period of time. If we go back in history, actually, sort of when when Indians were fighting their national struggle, at that time it was the Chiang Kai-shek government or the nationalist government in China. And they had supported India's desire or India's struggle for freedom. So there is a long-standing relationship between India and the Chinese government before the CCP took over. Secondly, it is geopolitical. Taiwan faces Chinese aggression. India faces Chinese aggression. Both countries do not want China to dominate either on the land or maritime front or even in economics, technology, and defense. And so both see each other as complementary. Taiwan has technology, India has people. India has a big market. India has economies of scale for Taiwanese companies. And finally, it's also strategic. Chip manufacturing and semiconductors are critical for the future of the world, and China alone should not be allowed to have access or production to these.
India has surpassed China in becoming the world's most populous nation. Is India ready to take on China economically?
If you ask Indians, they will say yes. I would say that India has the potential to take on China, but there's a lot more that India needs to do. It needs to encourage more investment. It needs to build better infrastructure. It needs to provide more incentives to companies coming into the market. And it needs to invest in its human capital, like, for example, Taiwan did decades ago.
India has now overtaken China as the world's most populous country, establishing itself as the world's largest market, presenting opportunities to leverage the demographic dividend in terms of labor and consumption. As we can see here, roughly 2/3 of India's population falls within the working age bracket, with a median age that is 10 years younger than that of China's. Now, of course, India also possesses an economically active workforce of 1.1 billion people, accounting for 75% of its population, surpassing that of any other major economy worldwide. Now, Professor Chen and I actually just concluded a trip from India. So I would like to ask Professor, what was your first-hand observation of India's economy right now?
I think we visit not many places in India, but what we can see is that there is large income inequality, inequality in the society. You also see that the society is stratified by caste system, which still have effect on its society. So there are many social problems, and another thing that we can observe in India, if you look at their daily life closely, is that they are really religiously pious. And the religious life really affect the way they live, the way they work a lot.
But do you still, despite the problem that we're seeing right now, do you also see some potentials that India possesses at this point of time?
You just mentioned that India has a large amount of young working force.
Right.
This is true. If you look at the population pyramid, and you mentioned that it is 10 years behind China. So this, if you look at this pyramid, you see the pyramid right now looks exactly like China 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, China is also a place full of labor forces. So given that the birth rate of India is lowering each year right now, we can anticipate that 10 years after, India will be looking very much like China today. So the large workforce will eventually become a aged society burden for Indian government. But still, that's a long time to come, right? So right now, the next 10 years, the next decade will be the golden decade for India, I would say.
But just one quick follow-up question. But you also mentioned earlier that your firsthand observation of India was of the large income inequality. There's a huge gap over there. But at the same time, we talk about workforce and economic, and this is the golden age for India. How do you think India can overcome this problem of income inequality?
I think most developing countries would try to overcome economic hardship by development, right? And usually development will need capital, and this is something that India would try to attract. China attracted a lot of foreign direct investment during the 80s and 90s. That's why it had the chance to rise, and India is trying to do the same. The differences here is that if you look at the manufacturing industry in India, it only takes 13% of its GDP. And if you look at 20 years before in China, manufacturing industry takes as much as 30% of their GDP. So that means India really need to have a sectorial reform to jump from a agriculture-based economy to industrialization-based economy.
So, Vice President, do you think that India staying neutral right now will also enhance or bring benefit to more capital investments from either the China or from the U.S.? Do you think this may also be part of their policy?
I think it's noteworthy to point it out, to point out several changes that facilitated what just happening. Firstly is the retreat of the enterprises from China as a production base to India. And also that's due to some policy failures in terms of a very strict policy on COVID prevention implemented in China. Also the increase of the concentration of powers in China. That's the first factor. The second factor is that due to that, and not only the United States, also Japan, South Korea, and even Taiwan are very eager to getting closer with the economic cooperation and technology development with India. And so that draws a large increase of foreign direct investment into India. The third one is, of course, the conditions that it possesses in India, including population bonuses and the very high technology proficiency of the Indian workforce. All those contributed to the golden era that we are about to witness in India's production as an innovation base and production base.
So why is this coming 10 years a golden era for India? The International Monetary Fund, as you can see over here, actually projected that Germany and the United Kingdom are expected to experience negative growth rates of minus 0.1% and minus 0.3% respectively. Now, look carefully. The United States is projected to achieve a growth rate of 1.6% and China at 5.2%. However, India beats all of them with an impressive projected growth rate of 5.9%. At the same time, the Center for Economics and Business Research says that India could surpass both Germany and Japan in the coming decade, emerging as the world's third largest economy. Now, Director Ashley just mentioned this earlier to us as well. So I would like to ask if, let's say, that China and India, they were to become significant economic competitor to each other, how do you think or do you foresee there is going to be an increased divergence between these two nations?
For now, India economy and Chinese economy are on different level.
Right.
So in the next 10 years also, I do think there should be a lot of area for them to work together, to collaborate. But of course, now China and India are putting so much energy to try for this breakthrough of high tech, and this would be the area for them to compete. But I do think that for now, since China is now banned by the United States to get access to high-end semiconductors, for example, and India is now just preparing to move into low-end semiconductor production, there should be certain area for them to work together, but under such a geopolitical competition, much may not be really secure whether they should work together or collaborate in the near future. But I do sense things manipulated by this geopolitical reason, India would follow most of development connecting with the United States and European countries to work through the process, gradually deviated from this collaboration with China. But I have to also emphasize bilateral trade, India and China are still developing and booming for now. So that may be something valuable for us to look into what exactly it would refer to geopolitical competition.
And Professor, you know, like what Director just said earlier, 10 years is still a long way to go, but at the same time, it's a glimpse of time as well. So do you think China at the same time will also keep an eye on India?
Well, China will, but in terms of economic development, I think they are more like partners rather than competitors. What China will be able to give, India will be willing to receive. So far, we haven't seen that Sino-Indian relations is affected by its economic ties. So economic relations still remain. But what happens in the future is that I think what's more important is that the shift of the global supply chain will shift from China and Southeast Asia to India. That will be the key. But we will not see a complete shift from one place to another place.
Right.
I think we will see different companies trying to shift their production base in different places in order to prevent geopolitical risk.
And
But,
Vice President, you were nodding your head. You agree?
Yes, may I just add 2 points? Firstly, is that some of them are some of the aspects are initiated by governmental policies. For example, Modi's policy of Made in India, and also the tax reduction for components and semi-finished products that being attractive to the big businesses to set up their bases in India. And second one is the supply chain consideration about resilience of the supply chain to ensure the safe supply of products, and also especially in terms of ICT and like internet components or chips. The current emphasis is on reliable and secure and trusted partners. And India, especially that the United States is expecting India to play that role, to be a large base that could supply clean and trusted, secure products of ICT products. And India I think, is happy to meet that expectation.
Right. So we're seeing that India could be regarded as a rising star right now, and we've been looking at the relationship between the U.S., China, and India. Now we're going to go back a little bit to see the relationship between Taiwan and India. As we can see, India currently holds the position of Taiwan's 17th largest economic and trade partner. Well, this bilateral trade volume has also witnessed a notable upswing, rising from $7.05 billion in 2018, well, that was before the pandemic, to, as you can see now, a record high of $8.459 billion in 2022. This growth has been primarily driven by trade in key sectors such as semiconductors and chemicals. Professor, how significant is this?
I recently attended a forum by Dr. Zhang Hongyuan, and he analyzed those data. So if you look closely to the trade data, you will see that the majority rise of the trade statistics is mainly from electronics components. So that means a lot of components are made in Taiwan and being shipped to India for assembly. And that also means that India has a manufacturing industry rising. So that's a good sign. That means India is pushing forward to its economic development. However, if we look at India's trade statistic, we know that Taiwan only take a fraction of it. So this also shows us the characteristic of global trade. Many products are made in Taiwan, shipped to China, and then shipped to India for final assembly. Yeah, so that's something that India will be doing in the future.
Right, but aside from semiconductor and chemicals that we're seeing right now, do you think there's any other industries in Taiwan that may also benefit in India?
Well, so far I would say electronics are the main industry. Yeah.
And as director, we would also like to ask you, because we just mentioned that Professor Chen just mentioned that India's, it's more like a semiconductor assembly. But so do you think with India's first semiconductor assembly facility that is projected to produce its first batch of domestically made chips in 2024, do you think this will eventually or ultimately have an impact on the geopolitical relationships between the US, China, and India in the short run or in the long run?
This should be in the long run. I don't personally see something happening in the next decade or so. Just remember, almost 2 years ago, when everyone in Taiwan recognized TSMC was preparing to move the manufacturers in the United States, Arizona. And during the time, I remember Morris Chang especially indicated, even for the United States, to resume all the manufacturers for the high-end chips, it would take almost 10 years to restart over again. So obviously, this is not just a building a factory and then you can start with the technology, with everything turning quickly. And basically, the process of TSMC teaches everyone, if you want to make a successful semiconductor industry, you need to build successful, comprehensive industrial clusters, which means that in India, it is not just build a few manufacturers for chips themselves. It also combined with a number of industrial clusters, factories, building different parts. And currently, we understand for the last few decades, India is pretty good at software design, but they are not very good at manufacturers. So this is something they desperately need to work with Taiwan. This happens to be the strongest Taiwan's industry can produce and connect with India.
But aside from what you just mentioned earlier, do you still think that there may still be some advantages for India in terms of semiconductor, aside from just relying on the other supply chain or relying on Taiwan? With India itself, do you see any advantage?
Yes, of course. India has such a high quality of designer engineers, which I remember over the last 2 decades, in between India and Taiwan, a group of people already advocating the idea India and Taiwan is just IT plus together. So on the Indian side, they are very much good at software. Taiwan is good at hardware. So combining together,
synergy.
Yes, moving forward.
Do you also believe that with India's most populous country right now and a workforce of young ages, and one thing very important to acknowledge is that their English proficiency, do you think they will rise very quickly and this will be one of the ultimate advantage they have over China?
Yes, as long as the government help industry find the right partners like Taiwan, and I'm sure India can really catch up very fast from the low-end semiconductor industry moving forward. But how much they can do, it all depends on the one I mentioned, industrial cluster develop in India.
And this is why I feel like a lot of countries are also desperately wanting to work with India. We can see that the United States, Japan, Australia, and UK have consulates in Mumbai. Now, recently, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs have also stated that they will begin working on opening a representative office in Mumbai. So, Vice President, in your opinion, what areas of Taiwan-India cooperation, we have been talking about advantages right now, but do you think there's any other parts that still need more cooperations or that can be strengthened?
Okay. Some of the momentum came from the business. To add that point, Professor just mentioned, and actually to fill the holes of the supply chain, actually India is drawing investment from Taiwan big businesses in their technology park. So-called learning from the models of the making that supply chain, the cluster more complete from the Taiwan experience. And also the business society communities of the both countries has been long interested in each other. So the trade and between the two countries has been growing sixfold in the past 2 decades, the investment growing even larger to the tenfold. And also that partly is due to Taiwan's government's own policy. In the Taiwan's government's new southbound policy, India has been put as a major partner that to be getting closer to. So in terms of trade, economy, and technology innovation, and playing its respective part in the supply chain security order after the U.S. Initiative, I think India and Taiwan has their relative parts to play.
And Professor, is there anything you would like to add on to that?
I would say that this is a very significant step for us. But also, I hope this will be the beginning for us to really get into the domestic business, in India. So they can, our businessmen can develop more business relationship with Mumbai's businessmen because they have connections with Persian Gulf and Pakistan and Iran and all that. And I hope that will open up some business opportunities.
So for India as whole, for Taiwan, this is a very important and significant step for us. But as you look at the news recently, Foxconn just recently announced their breakup with their joint venture partner in India due to external differences. So again, Professor, I would like to ask you, when in terms of external differences, what exactly do you mean by that? Is it the cultural differences that Taiwan still need to adapt to India?
Well, there are a lot of things Taiwan's businessmen need to adopt. So for one thing, Indians really take care of their families. They really emphasize their families. So they don't work overtime. They would like to stay at home. This is usually the most important problems our business
So we're seeing a
encounter.
value difference right here.
This is a fundamental value difference. They would rather commute for 2 hours to get to the factory instead of living in a dorm in a library, in a factory.
And Director, is there any take you would like to add on to this?
I do think looking into this difficulty, even Foxconn, such a leading manufacturers, cannot immediately work well with its partners in India. But of course, both of industry are looking for new partners. But I do think it will not be so easy for medium and small enterprises from Taiwan to develop their connection with India, because big company have their own advantage to connect, and much easier. They have a more comprehensive ability to connect with all necessary expertise, while a smaller company, which Taiwan has so many middle size of a company, want so much to develop operation in India. So in this sense, perhaps for the government, I do think Indian government and Taiwan's government should really work together to make it much smoother, easier for Taiwanese business to enter into the market in India, which I see over the last 2 decades, this is a critical thing, has not been completely solved. at this moment.
So we're seeing that right now. It's a very important and significant timing for Taiwan companies or businesses to work with Indian companies at the same time to invest in India. If we take a look at it vice versa, for Indian companies to work with Taiwanese companies, are there anything that they have to be more mindful because of the cross-strait relations that Taiwan is facing right now, Vice President?
Oh, the security side. May I just mention that India is watching very closely about what is happening in Taiwan Strait, given the growing intensity in this area. And also that's due to several factors. Firstly, is about India's own security threat from China, especially in 2020 about the border conflicts. And also the Chinese has been building their infrastructure on the border and increasing the personnel there. So India is facing the threat, and also India public are growing awareness about the anti-China sentiment has grown. And also on that basis, they pay notice, and the awareness of Taiwan's situation and drawing the sympathy with Taiwanese people has also grown. So we have this so-called alliance of milk tea, and because we are facing the same enemy, China. The second point is that there's a tremendous interconnectivity between the two theaters, Indian and Chinese border and the Taiwan Strait. And due to historical lessons is that after detente of reached between the United States and China in 1970s, actually India is feeling the increased pressures along its border, and leading to the building up of Chinese forces in recent conflicts. So India's think tanks saying that if what's happening in Taiwan Strait will actually, ironically, will lessen the pressure they feel along their border with China. And vice versa, if what's happening in India will also lessen the stress in Taiwan Strait. So the two theaters are really interconnected. So on that basis, the India policymakers are paying really close attention to Taiwan Strait situations.
And Professor, what is your take on this?
Well, I think Indian decision makers really do emphasize on this, but they also are aware of the fact that China is unlikely to provoke two conflicts at the same time, and it is unlikely that India will take advantage of a cross-strait conflict to take over the disputed border as well. So in terms of military actions, I think those are quite separate.
So for today, we literally looked into the kind of positive relationship that Taiwan and India will be having, and saying that this is a great time for Taiwanese companies or corporates to also invest in India and vice versa. And as for how well India play out within militarily and economically between the US and China, two superpower nations, is definitely something that the whole world will be watching. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you all next time.